Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Ambelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and very happy to welcome you to this penultimate session of our spring series. Although, of course, special welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time today. If you are joining us for the first time today, you can see previous sessions of the series at the series page that was in your reminder email that you got earlier today. As you know, if it's not your first time, our spring series has been called Timeless Insights, Timeless Wisdom, and it has been a kind of best of JTS scholarship experience. Today, we have a special guest instructor, and the series was originally scheduled to end today with Professor Ben Summers' Shavuot, pre-Shavuot session. But we've moved that to June 3rd because we had really a very wonderful special opportunity to bring in a guest today. And it also very much fits into the pre-Shavuot theme as we gear up to receiving the Torah, as Shavuot has been conceived in the many centuries after the destruction of the temple, when it ceased to be an agriculturally focused holiday. So our special guest today is Dr. Elias Sacks, who is director of the Jewish Publication Society, with whom JTS and JPS have always had a fond relationship of mutual admiration and different kinds of collaboration. So we're so pleased that he's here to teach us today. And he's going to be sharing with us the JPS, many of you may have on your shelves the JPS TANAKH, and there is a new edition of the JPS TANAKH that is gender sensitive. So his session today is called Gender, the Bible, and the Art of Translation, and he'll be sharing with us kind of the range of considerations that go into the enterprise of faithfully rendering a biblical text into contemporary English in a way that is also sensitive to gender, which may sound easy, and it is not at all. So it's just many interesting considerations at play. So we're so excited to learn with him. And I will, just before we begin, turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a couple of additional announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format for our session, Dr. Sacks will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll also have a Q&A period at the end. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Sacks. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. And I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Elias Sacks, Director of the Jewish Publication Society. Prior to joining JPS, Dr. Sacks was an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he also served as Director of the program in Jewish Studies. Dr. Sacks has published widely in modern Jewish thought, including the 2017 book Moses Mendelssohn's Living Script. He has also played leadership roles in a wide range of efforts to elevate the voices of emerging scholars and promote conversations between academia and the broader public. We're so pleased to have Dr. Sacks leading our session today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sacks.
Well, thank you so much, Tani, Rabbi Andelman, for those kind words of introduction, to Tani and to Ellie for all of your work making this possible, and really for the kind of invitation to be part of this wonderful series and intellectual community. And I also want to thank all of you who are here today for joining this conversation. I'm really excited to learn and think together. So as you just heard, I'm the director of JPS, of the Jewish Publication Society, and our topic today, Gender, the Bible, and the Art of Translation, is one that we at JPS have been wrestling with quite a bit, especially over the past year. And I'm going to share my screen right now just to set us up for that. Sorry, just give me a moment here. So Many of you probably know JPS as the Bible translation people, although of course we're more than that. I suspect that some of you might be familiar with our 1985 English translation of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, perhaps in the blue cover or the Hebrew English edition that you see on your screen, maybe through other volumes that use our translation, such as the Eitz Chaim Chumash or the Oxford Jewish Study Bible. And our translation has really become one of the gold standard English translations used in Jewish communal and academic settings. And as Rabbi Andelman mentioned, in October, we released the first major update of our translation in nearly 4 decades, entitled the JPS Tanakh Gender Sensitive Edition. And in ways that we'll think about together shortly, it's a translation that wrestles quite a bit with issues relating to gender, and it's generated a wide range of reactions. It's elicited praise and gratitude, but it's also elicited questions. What is this updated translation? What does gender sensitive mean? Is this the woke Bible? Why did we call it gender sensitive rather than, say, gender neutral or gender inclusive? Maybe most importantly, is it faithful to the Bible's Hebrew? So I think that part of what these reactions have shown is just how complicated it is, but also just how important it is to create spaces to think about this constellation of issues. And so that's what I'm hoping that we can do together today. And in particular, I'm hoping that we can think together about a series of questions. How should English translators of the Hebrew Bible approach questions relating to gender? When should gender-inclusive language, such as God or person, be used for references to God and human beings? And when does gendered terminology, such as king or man, called for, both historically and linguistically? What does it mean to faithfully render biblical Hebrew into contemporary English? And how can translators communicate their methodologies and their choices and their goals to readers and communities? And to think about these issues, I thought we could do 3 things. So first, I thought we could explore the challenges that arise when we wrestle with gender in Bible translation. Beyond the ways in which gender has become a kind of hot button social political issue, why is this such a fraught, complicated topic when it comes to translation? What's at stake here? Second, I thought that we could explore one approach to these challenges, the approach that we've adopted in our new Tanakh translation. And in particular, I thought that we could explore the ways we've approached references to God in our new translation, the ways we've approached references to human beings in that translation, and the ways we've approached the task, or what I might even call the responsibility of making our choices and approaches visible and legible to readers and communities. And finally, I thought that we could look toward the future, toward questions that emerge from the conversation we're about to have. Does this seem reasonable? The kind of challenges of gender in Bible translation, one approach to gender in Bible translation, and what this all means for all of us going forward. Okay, great. And as was mentioned, as is the custom in this series, we'll take some breaks for Q&A and discussion. Before I jump into the substance of our conversation, though, I want to just offer 2 preliminary remarks. One about the procedure for our conversation and one about the substance of our conversation. So in terms of procedure, since this is a conversation about translation, it's going to be important for us to juxtapose and move back and forth between a bunch of different kinds of texts. The Bible's Hebrew and our newest translation, the Bible's Hebrew and other translations, and all of those different translations. Sometimes I'll be able to get all of this on the PowerPoint screen in front of you. Sometimes, though, there won't be quite enough room. And so I'll always show you the English translations and Hebrew terms relevant to our discussion on your PowerPoint. Sometimes I won't be able to show you the full Hebrew. And so we've therefore provided you with a link to a PDF, as Tani mentioned, where the full Hebrew is available, along with the English and suggestions for further reading. So that's procedure. In terms of substance, as I've already shared, we're going to be using the newest JPS translation. You see it on your screen. I also have a copy here to explore the questions at the heart of the session. And, I am the director of JPS. And so on some level, then, I'm hardly an unbiased observer here. I was involved in and stand by our new translation. I embrace its approach, and I would, of course, love for you all to do the same. That said, I want to be very clear that my goal in this conversation today is not to sell you on our gender-sensitive Tanakh translation. Rather, I want to use our translation as an opportunity or occasion to think about how English translators of the Hebrew Bible might approach questions relating to gender. I'll outline the approach we adopt, but that approach is just that. It's the approach that we adopt, and one that, like all translations, needs to be carefully evaluated. In fact, one of the key themes that we'll take up is the importance of thinking about the approaches and choices and goals and methodologies that animate translations. The importance of making all of that visible and public and accessible. The importance of really inviting readers and communities into the work that goes into translation and into the conversations about just what's at stake in it. Okay, so with that in mind, let's turn to our first topic, the challenges that arise when we think about gender in Bible translation. And to identify these challenges, we need to begin by asking what our goal is when it comes to translating the Bible, right? What it is we're actually trying to do when we render the Bible into English. Well, there are many different ways to think about this. Different translators have taken different approaches, but at JPS, for our Bible translations, our animating goals have always been twofold: historical accuracy and religious musicality. We try to draw on the best of academic Bible scholarship and on the best of Jewish religious learning to present a translation that's faithful to the Hebrew, that captures what the Bible meant in its original context, and that does all of this in a manner that resonates with contemporary readers. So when we're thinking about gender and Bible translation in this session, then we're really thinking about how a translation animated by these twin goals might approach issues of gender. And to see why that can pose challenges, I think that an example from the book of Breshit, the book of Genesis, will be instructive. And in particular, I'd like to look at one of the Bible's best known passages, the lines that describe the creation of human beings, Genesis 1:26 and 1:27, both in the original Hebrew and in a series of translations. So the Hebrew, which you have on your source sheet, but hopefully see on your screen now as well, reads as follows. Vayomer Elohim na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu, vayirdu v'gat hayam uve'of hashamayim uve'behema uvechol haaretz uvechol haremes haremes al haaretz vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo b'tzelem Elohim bara oto zachar u'nekeva bara otam. So I imagine that many of you have encountered this passage before in one of its influential English translations. For example, on your screen right now, you see how these lines appear in the King James Version of the Bible from 1611. This is a translation that many people still think of as the English version of the Bible. Reads, as you see, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Another example you may be familiar with is the translation in the New Revised Standard Version from 1989. This is a translation that's widely used among many Christian communities and in certain parts of the academic world. So in the New Revised Standard Version, these lines are rendered. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And finally, I suspect that you may know this passage, or at least some of you may know this passage, in the 1985 JPS translation that I mentioned earlier, the one that's widely used across diverse Jewish communities and in many parts of the academic world, the kind of one in that blue cover and the Hebrew English edition that I showed earlier. This is a translation that's conventionally known as the New JPS translation, or NJPS, because it replaced an earlier JPS translation from 1917. And in this translation, the lines read, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." So there's a lot to recommend each of these translations, although I, of course, am partial to NJPS. Nevertheless, given what we now know about the Bible in its original historical context, and given the conventions of English in 2024, these translations also make a number of moves that are contestable at best, and that can in fact pose real problems for some readers. I'm going to focus on how this plays out in NJPS, in that iconic 1985 JPS translation, but what I have to say applies to the other translations as well. So first of all, these translations assume that the biblical God can be described in English in masculine terms. In King James, we read that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. In the New Revised Standard Version, we read that God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. There's some move towards more inclusive language for human beings with that word humankind, but God is still being described in emphatically male terms. And finally, in NJPS on the screen, as you see before you, now highlighted in red, we read that God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, it's of course true. It's of course true that the Bible uses grammatically masculine language. For example, grammatically masculine Hebrew verb forms when speaking about God here. And in fact, given the realities of biblical Hebrew, the Bible doesn't really have any choice. We can go into this more in the Q&A if people are interested. We can also look beyond the verbs used here to look at kind of possessive endings. But to offer a somewhat simplified account, biblical Hebrew is a language where verbs in the third person, verbs like danced in the phrase person X danced, or like jumped in the phrase person Y jumped, those verbs have to be conjugated, have to be formed, either according to a masculine pattern or according to a feminine pattern. And in this particular passage, the verbs used for said and created when talking about God, vayomer, vayivra, and bara, all follow a masculine form. And again, given how biblical Hebrew works, the Bible can't get around using this sort of language. Nevertheless, if our goal in translation isn't simply to capture the grammatical technicalities of the Bible's Hebrew, but also to capture the meaning of the Bible's Hebrew, it's far from clear that using a male language in English is the right way to go here. That is, if we're animated by those twin goals of historical accuracy and religious musicality, if we're trying to be faithful to the Tanakh's Hebrew, to capture what the Bible meant in its original historical context, and to do all of this in a way that speaks to contemporary readers, it's not clear that using a male language in English is the best way to get at what the Bible means. And we can see this if we dive a bit more into NJPS, into our previous JPS translation. So when that translation, when NJPS came out in 1985, it was still common to use male language in English in a generic manner. That is to say, it was common to use man or mankind to mean humankind, including both men and women. It was common to use man or he to mean just any person, regardless of gender. And so in 1985, hearing he and his for God might have sounded neutral and natural. In 2004, however, that's simply not how English works in many settings. Right? In many settings, we now try to avoid saying man or mankind when we mean humanity. In many settings, we now try to avoid saying a man or he when we're not trying specifically to refer to a male person, with the result that using the former kind of language, right, using masculine terminology can be jarring, and it can sound like a deliberate decision to emphasize maleness, even when that's not our intention or what's at stake. And this means that he and his terminology in Genesis 1 now sounds very different than it might have sounded in 1985. It can be quite disconcerting for many readers. Rather than sounding neutral or natural, it can come across as actually casting God as male, or at least as emphasizing or hinting at some sort of divine maleness. And that can cause challenges. First of all, it's not at all clear that this is what the Bible was actually attempting to do in its original historical context. It's not clear that the Bible is actually attempting to convey the idea that God is male. While some academic Bible scholars argue that the Tanakh's original audience would have understood the biblical God as male, other academic Bible scholars reject this idea and suggest that the Tanakh's original audience would have understood God as beyond gender. It might be, in other words, that terms like his and he are actually distorting or concealing the meaning of the Bible's Hebrew text. That given the way that those terms function in English today, they have the effect or impact of casting God as male, even though that's not what the Bible or Hebrew is trying to do here. And this worry, I think, is only exacerbated by the fact that, as you can see, at least on some readings, the text seems to cast the divine image as encompassing both male and female. Again, raising the possibility that terms like his or he in English aren't getting at what the Hebrew text would have conveyed to its ancient audience. Moreover, as I imagine many of you are aware, right, for many readers in 2024, male English terms aren't just potentially inaccurate from a historical perspective, they're also potentially alienating from a religious perspective. Right? Some contemporary readers experience God as beyond gender. Right? On their view, God is neither male nor female, nor linkable to any gender identity. Some contemporary readers experience God as in some sense encompassing multiple genders, as in some sense broader than male, female, or any gender identity. Some readers simply aren't sure and want to come to their own conclusions about whether God is male or female or linkable to gender. And for those readers, when a translation uses terms like his or he for God, it can seem like the translation simply isn't for them. Like the translation is prejudging the matter. Like the translation is imposing an image of God as male, even when that image is not the only possible one. It can feel, that is, like the translation is forcing a male picture of God on readers when that picture simply isn't how they understand the deity. And when that picture actually isn't compelled by the text or history or theology or anything else. It can feel like the translation is setting up barriers between the reader on the one hand and the Bible and its teachings on the other. And the same, by the way, is true of that term man in this passage. It can feel jarring, disconcerting, unnatural to emphasize the maleness of the human beings being created, especially when they're explicitly cast as being both male and female. So I'm not going into all of this to beat up on King James or NRSV or NJPS. Rather, I'm going through all of this because I want to highlight what I see as a key challenge relating to gender in Bible translation. How we can address issues of gender in a way that's faithful to the Bible's Hebrew, to the Bible's context, and to contemporary life. Right? How can we handle the gender dimensions of Bible translation in a way that attends to the nuances of the Tanakh's Hebrew, that draws on what we know from academic Bible scholarship, and that meets the needs of 21st century individuals? I think that what's at stake in this question of gender and Bible translation is nothing less than the question of how to make the Bible, its ancient world, and its enduring lessons accessible to individuals and communities today. How to open up the biblical text for contemporary readers and empower them to explore the biblical past while also connecting it to their present. And so this is the kind of challenge that motivated our new Tanakh translation, which we're abbreviating as RJPS, or the Revised JPS translation. The single most important thing to know about this new translation is precisely that. It's a new translation. It doesn't touch the Bible's Hebrew. Instead, it asks how that Hebrew should be translated into English in a way that's both historically rigorous and religiously meaningful. More specifically, it goes through the Tanakh word by word, line by line, verse by verse, and asks when gender-inclusive renderings are appropriate and when gendered ones are called for historically and linguistically. For example, it asks whether a term for a human being should be translated as person or as man. It asks whether a reference to God should be translated with gender-neutral language, for instance, simply as God, or with a male-sounding term such as king. And then in each case, it offers what it thinks the best English translation is for that particular context. Our approach, in other words, begins from the idea that while the Bible's Hebrew won't be touched, its English renderings might change over time. Right? It's not that a translation like NJPS was necessarily wrong for its time or necessarily wrong for everyone today. It's not that we want to tell readers that gendered language is always inappropriate, and it's absolutely not the case that we're changing the Hebrew of the Tanakh. Rather, what animates our JPS, what animates the revised JPS translation, is a sense that in light of changes in scholarship in English, our existing translations needed to be revisited with fresh eyes, and that we needed to go through every word, every line, every verse, and ask whether that specific moment in the Bible calls for gendered or gender-inclusive language. So look, for example, at how the gender-sensitive translation, RJPS, translates Genesis 1:26 through 1:27. For the sake of simplicity, I've highlighted the changes from RJPS in red. They, of course, don't appear as red in the translation itself. So in our new edition, we translate these lines as follows. And God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all creeping things that creep on earth. And God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. So much of what NJPS did remains in place. However, references to man have become references to humankind, reflecting a determination that what's at stake here is the creation of humanity broadly understood. Similarly, while the English wording has been reframed so that we're avoiding using male terms like he or his for God, so that we're not prejudging, predetermining God's gender. On the one hand, for a reader who believes firmly that the biblical God is indeed male, nothing is stopping them from continuing to hold that view. We're not using female pronouns or even gender-neutral pronouns for God. And in fact, we try to avoid third-person pronouns altogether for God. God is never referred to in this translation as he, she, or they. But on the other hand, for a reader who does not see God as gendered male, or who sees God as beyond gender altogether, the translation is now compatible with that view as well. God is not he, God is just God. The text, in other words, has been opened up. Rather than prejudging whether the biblical God is male, we're making it possible for the biblical God to be understood and experienced in diverse ways. We're empowering readers. We're providing a translation that remains faithful to the Bible's Hebrew and resonates both with what we know from academic scholarship and with the lived English of contemporary communities. And so this is what we try to do. We go through the Tanakh and try to figure out what sort of rendering is appropriate in each case. And to see what this means, let's first look at some references to God. We'll then take a break for a Q&A, and then we'll look at references for human beings and take another break. So first, as I noted above, when it comes to God, we typically avoid grammatically masculine labels, such as he or him, right? Creation is now a narrative where God creates human beings in the divine image, rather than one where he creates man in his image. We also no longer translate the tetragrammaton, God's four-letter name, consisting of the Hebrew letters Yud, He, Vav, He, as the Lord in small capital letters. This is a translation with which I suspect many of you are familiar, but it's also one that can sound extremely masculine to some readers, right? For many readers, Lord sounds like a male title. It sounds like it stands in contrast to lady, that gets steeped in classic gender hierarchies. Rather, depending on the context, we now typically translate the tetragrammaton as God in distinctive small capitals, or in some cases as the eternal. A good example is the famous vision of the future in Isaiah 2. You see it first on your screen here in NJPS, in our 1985 translation. In the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house, right, the house of Yud He Vav He, shall stand firm above the mountains, and many peoples shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, the mount of Yud He Vav He, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of the Lord, the Devar of Yud He Vav He, from Jerusalem. Thus he will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples. and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. So in this rendering, the God who rules in this redeemed world is described in emphatically male terms, right? As the Lord, with his ways, his paths, his judgments. However, it's not clear that maleness is what the biblical text is trying to convey or emphasize here. It's not at all clear that what the Bible is trying to do is remind us that the God who rules in this better future world is in some sense male. And in fact, for many readers, it can be jarring to experience this transformed, redeemed world with language emphasizing the deity's maleness. And so to address this, then, RJPS translates the Tetragrammaton as God and rewords the English to avoid all of those hises and he's. We now read about the Mount of God's house, about going up to the Mount of God, about being instructed in God's ways, about walking in God's paths, about the word of God and God's judgments, right? One of the Bible's most powerful visions of the future has been opened up. The translation no longer prejudges whether the deity associated with a future era of peace and harmony needs to be understood in male terms. Right? God remains a ruler, but not necessarily a lord. God's ways and paths and judgments pervade, but they're God's rather than his. Now, we'll pause in a moment for questions, but before I do so, I want to be clear. There are still scattered cases where we use male English terminology in connection with God. And in particular, as our translators went through each line and each verse, there were moments where they determined that the imagery used for God has gendered connotations. And in those cases, we use English that tries to convey those connotations. A good example is the Hebrew term melech, which in NJPS, in our 1985 translation, we typically rendered as king. Now, in most cases where melech is used of God in the Tanakh, it seems like what the Tanakh is interested in is God's status as a sovereign or ruler, rather than the question of whether God is more like a male or female ruler. So in most cases, then, we render melech with a gender-neutral term, such as sovereign. There are some cases, though, where that melech imagery in question does seem to have gendered connotations. An instructive example that you now see on the screen is Psalm 24, which many of you may know from the traditional Jewish liturgy. It's the psalm traditionally recited on weekdays and holiday services when the Torah scroll is returned to the Ark. And you see on your screen now how we translate it in RJPS. Of David, a psalm. The earth is God's and all that it holds, the world and its inhabitants. O gates, lift up your heads, up high, you ever outlasting doors, so the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? God, mighty and valiant, God, valiant in battle. O gates, lift up your heads, lift them up, you everlasting doors, so the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? God of hosts is truly the King of glory, Selah. God is again and again referred to here as Melech HaKavod, the Melech of glory. And the image here seems to be military. God is a Melech who leads the celestial hosts, the heavenly forces in battle, and is mighty and valiant. And in the Bible's world, the Melech who led hosts, who led forces into battle, was typically a king and not a queen. It was a specifically kingly role to lead these military endeavors. And so we use the word king here, not sovereign. Our commitment is to coming up with the right translation for each biblical moment. And in this moment, God is being likened to an earthly king, not just to a generic earthly sovereign. Now, these cases are the exception rather than norm. Generally, we use gender-neutral language for God. We avoid all third-person pronouns, as I said, no he's, she's, and they's. But there are cases like this where we've determined that the imagery used has gendered connotations and thus requires a gendered translation. In a moment, we'll see how all of this plays out for human beings. But for now, I want to pause and open things up to see if there are any questions or issues people would like to think through together.
Thank you so much. And I hope it's clear to folks why we felt like this guest presentation fits so beautifully into what we've been trying to do for the last 4 years in our Monday series, which is, bring you texts, share texts with you in a way that's very firmly academically rooted and also speaks to where people are today, spiritually and communally and otherwise. So that's what this enterprise is, and that's why we're so excited about it. So we do have some questions. All right, so you mentioned early on, as you were kind of sharing the core considerations, that some of the core considerations that went into the project, the term religious musicality, and someone asked if you could explain that more.
Yeah, this is probably a term that I use too frequently. One of my advisors in graduate school used to use this term. What I mean by religious musicality is a translation that speaks not just to kind of purely academic needs, but a translation that speaks to the needs and feelings and realities of individuals and communities who take themselves to be involved in Jewish religious life today. So we want this to be a translation, on the one hand, that any academic Bible scholar can look at and say, you know, I might disagree with things it's doing, but this is rooted in biblical scholarship. But we don't want someone to pick up this text and simply say, oh, wow, this is a dry academic rendering of the Bible, of the Tanakh, that I could never imagine using with the B'nai Mitzvah students, during services, on my own, looking for inspiration in a Torah study group. We want these translations to speak to the needs of religious communities today. And that's what I'm trying to get at when I use that phrase, religious musicality. It's a translation that feels like it has a sense for the flavor, the dynamics, the realities of the lives of individuals who see the Tanakh not simply as an artifact of the ancient world, but as a living, breathing religious text that speaks to us today.
Thank you. Okay, I just got a flood of new questions while you were talking, but they actually mostly coalesce around a couple of core questions. So many people asked about different names of God, and how, for example, Adonai and Elohim, which in previous editions were translated as, you mentioned, Lord and God. So how do we distinguish between those? You mentioned the capital letters, I think, but there was a lot of interest in that. And then a number of people also asked about the Shekhinah, the idea of either, sort of a feminine way of understanding God that may appear here and there in the text, and also, an idea of the Shekhinah as a consort of the male God. So those were some of the kind of specific questions about specific God names and roles that were just shared.
Yeah, so clearly I should have given a shorter answer to the first question, because it gave people time to raise two of the most difficult issues we wrestled with in this translation. So that will be a lesson to me about brevity and concision that I'm already not following. Let me take each of those questions in turn, beginning with the question of different names or terms for God, and then turning to this question of female imagery for God in the Tanakh. In terms of names for God, and in particular in terms of contrasting the tetragrammaton, right? Yud He Vav He, the four-letter name of God that traditionally is not pronounced out loud in Jewish contexts, from other terms that for God, like Elohim, El, a whole set of terms. We really struggled with this. We really went back and forth on this. We knew early on that we didn't want to translate Yud He Vav He as Lord in small capitals anymore. First of all, there's a tradition of doing that in Judaism, but there's also a tradition of rejecting that kind of translation for many reasons. But our real concern was twofold. One, it sounds very male. right? We found that many readers again and again hear Lord as in contrast to lady, right? Lord is the lord of a castle. Um, and second, Lord is not a name. Lord is a title. So we really struggled with what to do here. In an earlier version, a kind of pilot version of part of this translation that we published in 2006 called the Contemporary Torah, that was just a translation of the Torah. We just presented the Tetragrammaton, God's name, in untransliterated Hebrew. We just wrote Yud, He, Vav, He. And we found that that was not a satisfactory answer given the diverse communities that use our text. There are many people who use the JPS translation who are steeped in traditional Jewish learning, and they know how to read Hebrew, and they see Yud, He, Vav, He, and they immediately know what to do. And there are other people who see it and just had no idea what to do with that. We would get streams of questions saying, what are these strange marks? Or they seem to be Hebrew, but what should I do with them? So we felt like Yud, He, Vav, He wasn't the right solution to make the text as accessible as possible. We also thought writing in English, Y-A-W-E-H, Yahweh, as one kind of pronunciation, but we found that didn't work either. Many people hear it as either they don't know what this is, right? They see it and they have no idea that this is the deity being described, or they feel uncomfortable saying it out loud. Then the text becomes a text that can't be read out loud, and many people use this as a translation that's read aloud. We really struggle, and so we ended up coming down on this idea. And I'm just going to share my screen again so I can show people what this looks like. We ended up coming down on this idea. Just going to go back for a moment. Of using God in small capitals. So we keep that idea of translating the tetragrammaton.
Sorry to interrupt. We're seeing your notes right now.
You're seeing my notes right now. You're not seeing, let me stop sharing then. I apologize. Are you seeing the PowerPoint now?
We're seeing Isaiah now.
Amazing. Much better Isaiah than me. So we kept the idea of translating God, of keeping the tetragrammaton in English in small capitals from Lord, so that God in small capitals looks different from God in regular letters. But we decided that we would translate the tetragrammaton as God in small capitals to avoid gendered terminology and to get at the way in which the deity being described there is both the same and different from the deity being described with other kinds of words, right? So the deity who's being described with the term God there, Yud He Vav He, is both in some ways the same and different from the deity who's being described as Elohim and being translated in regular letters there, right? There are ways in which this deity is the same character throughout the Bible, and there are ways in which different names and terms for God point to different historical layers, textual strands, conceptions of God. And so we felt that this approach of translating God's name as God in small capitals and other terms for God as God in regular letters was a way of getting at the idea that it's both the same and different figures being described in both of those moments. That does potentially introduce some awkward moments where the tetragrammaton appears in close proximity to other terms for God. We want to avoid translations like God, your God. And so in those cases, we translate God's name as the eternal. And there's a long tradition of this in German Jewish Bible translation and in modern Jewish Bible translation more generally. That's how we handle different terms for God. Let me try to very briefly address the issue of different gendered conceptions of God in the Bible. I apologize for going on so long. This was another challenge we faced because there are moments in the Bible where there is absolutely female imagery used to describe God. One approach would be to go through each moment in the Bible and sometimes use male terminology and sometimes use female terminology and sometimes use gender neutral terminology based on what we think is going on in the text at that particular moment. We didn't feel like that was doable. We felt like that for most readers would introduce a real sense of disruption in the biblical picture of God. And so we have decided to consistently go with gender neutral terminology for God, with the exception of those moments like sometimes translating Melech as king. We've decided to just avoid any pronouns for God at all. But there are moments where that does run the risk of obscuring either a kind of more male conception of God operating at a particular moment in a text, or a more female conception of God operating at another moment in the text.
Thank you. And I appreciate your answer, what you just said, because someone commented, for me, I'm not speaking for myself, I'm paraphrasing the commenter. For me, the kind of removing any gendered pronouns feels clunkier than just using he like I'm used to. So as you alluded to, for some people, male translation is just comfortable and does not feel like kind of an assault to one's feminism or anything like that. And for others, I would include myself in the latter group. It's really in my face and it bothers me. And similarly, there are people for whom a feminine translation of God would be sort of distracting. So I really appreciate that that the translators really considered kind of the range of sensitivities or non-sensitivities people are bringing in. So let me squeeze in one more question, kind of on the general front, and then we can continue. But a few people brought up non-binary, trans, those kinds of questions. So it has been a long time since people identifying as women have felt excluded by biblical translations, and now we're sensitized to even a broader conception of gender. And I wonder how much of that kind of came into play over the course of the project.
Yeah, it's absolutely something that was very much on our mind. Our hope is that by avoiding gendered terminology for God, we are avoiding prejudging any questions about whether God is associated with no gender, one gender, whether God encompasses multiple genders. When it comes to gendered language for God, we really try very deliberately to empower a wide range of experiences of God. When it comes to human beings, we typically end up either using gender neutral terminology or male or female terminology. I'm going to talk about this more in a moment, but we're really trying to balance here two kinds of considerations: that religious musicality that I mentioned, but also providing people with a window into the Bible's world. And generally in the Bible's world, and I say generally there because there are important exceptions. Generally in the Bible's world, the Bible is operating with a conception of two genders, male and female, not exclusively, but generally that's how the Bible seems to be operating. So by and large, we try to either use gender neutral language, or if we think that either a male or female conception of gender in the Bible's world is at stake, use that. And this is one of the reasons, and I'll talk about this later, we ended up using the phrase gender sensitive rather than gender inclusive to describe this translation. For better or for worse, this is not a translation that's inclusive in the sense that we often use the word inclusive today. It is a translation that reflects the Bible's world, which is a world steeped in all sorts of classic gender hierarchies, all sorts of gender binaries. We're not trying to turn the Bible's world into the world we experience today. We're trying to provide a window into the Bible's world. And we found that generally, when it comes to references to human beings, where biblical scholarship leaves us today is either using gender neutral terminology or in some cases using male and female terminology. That means there are moments in this text that do not at all feel inclusive, and there are moments in this text that can feel profoundly disturbing. We're going to look at least one example of that later. So it's a question with which we struggled. It's a question that we take very seriously, and it's a question that I think is reflected in the way in which we end up handling a lot of the language for God on the one hand and human beings on the other.
Thank you. All right, that was a long Q&A segment even for us. So let's let you continue with your presentation.
Well, I contributed to it being that long, so I apologize for that. Let me try to successfully share my PowerPoint now rather than my notes. Is it my PowerPoint that's showing up now?
Yes.
Amazing. So I just began to talk about references to human beings, and let's continue that now. So here too, we adopt that same approach that I just outlined. We go through each reference to human beings and ask whether just men are in view or whether the reference is to persons in general, without particular concern for gender. So what you see on your screen right now is a famous passage from Leviticus 19 in its 1985 rendering in NJPS. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, am your God. So in this passage that seems to demand equality with, or at least concern for the stranger, the non-Israelite, right? The gendered language just sort of jumps out here, right? Is it just the male stranger who's in view here, or is it a generic stranger, regardless of gender? Is this just a call to treat male strangers like male citizens, or is this a demand to extend care to all strangers, male and female? So our translators made the determination that it's the latter. So this is how we render it in our JPS. When strangers reside with you in your land, you shall not wrong them. The strangers who reside with you shall be to you as your citizens. You shall love each one as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Eternal, am your God. So the broad reach of this passage, that it's not just about the male stranger, but about all strangers, is now made clear. It's each one who should be loved, not just him. And you'll see, by the way, a moment where we translate the tetragrammaton, God's name, as eternal rather than God. Otherwise, we would end up with the infelicitous phrase, I, God, am your God. Another example of how we handle references to human beings comes in Exodus 18, when Moses is being given advice about appointing other individuals who will assist him in judging. This is how we render this in NJPS in that 1985 translation. I will give you counsel and God be with you. You represent the people before God. You bring the disputes before God and enjoin upon them the laws and the teachings and make known to them the way they are to go and the practices they are to follow. You shall also seek out from all the people capable men who fear God, Anshe Chayil Yirei Elohim, trustworthy men who spur ill-gotten gain, Anshe Emet Sonei Vatza. Set these over them as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Now, of course, in the Bible's world, leadership roles were largely reserved for men. And so in that sense, imagining Moses as being called upon to seek capable men and trustworthy men might seem like a reasonable translation choice. Even here, though, the picture is complicated. So first of all, to cite just one example, later in the Tanakh, Deborah, a woman, will become a leader, at least opening up the possibility that it was conceivable, imaginable for women to take on leadership roles in some parts of the biblical world. Moreover, it's far from clear that what this text is really concerned about here is the maleness of its leaders, rather than their status as capable, God-fearing, and trustworthy individuals, right? Even if leadership roles were predominantly male, the text seems more interested in elevating the admirable character traits of those individuals called to fill such roles rather than their maleness. And finally, the Hebrew term used here, anashim, is one that can be used in a number of ways. It can be used in biblical Hebrew to refer specifically to a man, but it can sometimes refer to people or a group of people in general. So the RJPS translators therefore render this passage with references not just to capable men who fear God and to trustworthy men, but rather with references to those who are capable and who fear God, and to trustworthy ones who spur ill-gotten gain. Right? Rather than prejudging the question of whether the Bible thinks that it's only men who can serve in leadership roles, this translation takes the Bible to talk about those leaders as those who are capable and who fear God and who are trustworthy ones. Rather than taking maleness to be a key concern of this passage, This updated translation directs attention to the leadership qualities at stake, right? And rather than run the risk of implicitly sending the message to contemporary readers that women stand outside the scope of biblically inspired authority, this translation holds open a broader vision of people who are biblically qualified to exercise leadership. Now, again, I want to be clear here. As with references to God, RJPS does not abandon gendered language when it comes to human beings. On the contrary, while there's a relatively small number of cases where we retain gendered language for God, there are many more cases where we retain gendered language for human beings. These are cases where we've determined that the gender of the people in question is very much at issue for the Bible. Consider as one example the following passage from Exodus 22. This is the translation in our new gender-sensitive edition. If a man seduces a virgin for whom the bride price has not been paid and lies with her, he must make her his wife by payment of a bride price. If her father refuses to give her to him, he must still weigh out silver in accordance with the bride price for virgins. So in the Bible's world, the concern was not simply with people seducing virgins, regardless of whether those virgins are male or female. Right? Rather, the concern was with a man seducing a female virgin and everything that would follow. And therefore, we've retained that gender language. Put differently, as I said in response to one of Rabbi Endelman's questions, we're not attempting to obscure the deeply and profoundly gendered nature of the biblical world. The Bible's world was one where there were bride prices, not spouse prices, where fathers had rights over daughters, where husbands exercised privileges denied to wives, where gender roles were often emphasized. And our translation tries to capture all of that. We're not attempting to transform the Bible's world into the world of 21st century readers. Rather, we're attempting to open up the Bible's world to those 21st century readers. Now, again, soon we'll pause for more questions, but I just want to add that even in the sorts of cases I just described, even in cases where gendered language seems important and where our English in RJPS continues to reflect that, even in those cases, there are instances where we felt that some updates were needed. A good example is an episode in 2 Samuel chapter 20. The background here is that an individual named Sheva ben Bichri, Sheba the son of Bichri, has rebelled against King David. And so David sends his trusted military commander Yoav to pursue this rebel. And Sheba comes to a city known as Avelah Beit Ma'akah, Abel of Beit Ma'akah, and the following episode occurs. And I'm going to first share this episode in our 1985 translation. All the troops with Yoav were engaged in battering the wall of the city, when a clever woman, an Isha Hachama, shouted from the city, "Listen, listen, tell Yoav to come over here so I can talk to him." He approached her, and the woman asked, "Are you Yoav?" "Yes," he answered. And she said to him, "Listen to what your handmaid has to say." "I'm listening," he replied. And she continued, "I am one of those who seek the welfare of the faithful in Israel. But you seek to bring death upon a mother city in Israel. Why should you destroy the Lord's possession?" Yoav replied, far be it from me to destroy or to ruin, not at all. But a certain man from the hill country of Ephraim named Sheba, the son of Bichri, has rebelled against King David. Just hand him alone over to us, and I will withdraw from the city." The woman assured Yoav, "His head shall be thrown over the wall to you." The woman came to all the people with her clever plan, Vatavo ha'isha el kol ha'am bechochmata, and they cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri, and threw it down to Yoav. He then sounded the horn. Those attacking the city dispersed to their homes, and Yoav returned to the king in Jerusalem. There's a lot going on here. This is sometimes referred to as the story of the woman of Abel Beit Ma'akah, and it's a striking one. It's one where this enigmatic figure confronts David's military commander in the midst of a siege, where she comes up with a plan to save her city from destruction, and where she has the standing or skills or qualities or something to convince the city to follow her plan, and where she thereby successfully ends the siege and saves her community. In 2024, though, it's not clear that the best way to render the Hebrew used to describe this figure and her plan That phrase, Hebrew phrases Isha Hachama and Chokmata is clever woman and clever plan. I'm not entirely sure how these phrases would have resonated in 1985, but today in 2024, that term clever, I think especially that phrase clever woman, can sound at best inadequate and at worst dismissive. It can sound like this individual is being described as coming up with a kind of neat trick or a savvy ruse, rather than a carefully calibrated plan that stops a military leader in his tracks, wins approval from a city, and saves a community from catastrophic devastation. It can sound like this figure is kind of being given a pat on her head for her cleverness, rather than being praised for a striking intervention in Israelite political and military affairs. In our JPS, then, we replace that term clever with the term wise. She is now a wise woman who confronts Yoav. The plan that she brings to the city is a wise one. We've retained gendered language. The figure in question is still a wise woman, but we've updated some of the language used to describe her. And I just add parenthetically that this is a moment where our revised translation not only reflects what we see as the narrative context of the Bible's Hebrew, it's also more consistent with later Jewish exegetical traditions. As some of you may know, there's a long line of rabbinic interpretations that praise the woman of Abel Beit Maacah. For example, in some texts, her negotiation with Yoav to avert the destruction of her city is likened to Abraham's negotiation with God to try to avoid the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Similarly, she's identified in some texts with the legendary figure Serach bat Asher, Serach, the daughter of Asher, a character who gets mentioned twice in the Tanakh, but is turned by the rabbis into a figure of really extraordinary wisdom and importance and longevity. For example, who plays a key role in the Exodus from Egypt, who was at least extremely long-lived, and who by some accounts never actually dies. Wise woman seems to align more closely with these traditions than clever woman. And so this is what we mean when we call our translation gender sensitive. It's sensitive in the sense of being attentive to how gender and language function in the Hebrew Bible. It addresses issues related to gender in a manner that's faithful to the Hebrew, that's steeped in academic scholarship and Jewish learning, and that resonates with contemporary readers. Okay, so in a moment, I want to turn to a third component of our approach. We've talked about how we handle references to God, how we handle references to human beings, but I also want to think about how we can make all of this visible and intelligible to readers and communities. But before we do so, though, I want to take another break for Q&A to see if there are other issues that we should be thinking about together.
Thank you. Well, this question isn't actually about gender, but so many people have asked it that maybe I'll ask it anyway. And you were getting at this, I think, a little in the last example, but it was still a gender related kind of consideration that went into that update. But several people have asked, were there other changes in the translation, really totally unrelated to gender, because scholarship changes over time, how we use English changes over time. So several people asked that, so I wanted to pose that to you.
I'm really grateful to you for asking that, because I was trying to think of a non-awkward way of bringing this up during the session that didn't just sound like me bragging about the translation. And now, instead of me bragging, I'm just being sensitive and responsive to the question. So I really appreciate that. Absolutely, the bulk of the revisions we introduce certainly involve gender, but there are several other kinds of changes as well. There are some typos we fix. I mean, not typos in the Hebrew of the Tanakh, but typo in our translation. There are moments where some of our translations were unclear, but I would say there are really, broadly speaking, two kind of categories or buckets of changes we make that go beyond gender. One has to do with ritual terminology in the Bible, and in particular, two fraught terms in Hebrew, tameh and tahor. In our 1985 translation, we typically translated those terms as clean and unclean. For many years, we've been dissatisfied with that choice because it suggests that when the Bible is talking about people who are either tameh or tahor, it's worried about cleanliness, about hygiene. As if the reason someone is tameh and thus kind of can't quite approach God, or is tahor and can approach God, as if the main issue is that they're covered in schmutz, right? And they just need to take a shower. That doesn't seem to be what the Bible is interested in. The Bible is interested in some kind of state of ritual impurity or purity, some state where a person has been rendered more or less capable of entering into a relationship with, or a relation with, or the presence of the divine at that particular moment. So we have updated tameh and tahor. We now we haven't updated the categories. We've updated our translation of them. We now translate those terms as impure and pure. And there are also certain kinds of sacrifices that where we update the terminology, where we think the way we did it in 1985 maybe didn't work as well as it could have. That's one kind of change. Another kind of change has to do with just archaic English language. There are phrases that were, I mean, forget 1985 and 2024. I feel this all the time when I talk to my children who are 12 and 6. There are phrases I use that either are misunderstood by them or seem completely foreign to them. And so we try to also identify terms that have maybe become a little more archaic. There are far fewer references to beseeching and bewailing, for example, in our new translation than there were in 1985. There's still a few moments, but those are terms that I think don't quite resonate with many contemporary readers in the way they might have at that point. So those are additional kinds of changes we have made.
Thank you. Okay, and another, so long as we're on the topic of not directly related to gender, but a few people noted that it seems that the translation is only available in English right now, and what's with that?
Yeah. So I'll talk about this shortly. It's actually also available online at Safaria. I'll talk about that in a moment. That was a very deliberate decision, both to make the translation as accessible as possible and to provide a number of ways to get more of an insight into the work of translation. I'll talk about that shortly. So you can get it with Hebrew there. We are planning to bring out a Hebrew English edition of this shortly. It's a monumental task to bring out a Hebrew English edition in terms of, I'm not going to ramble about all of the work involved in that, but everything from the Masoretic signs to the typesetting. And we felt that this translation needed to be out there in the world. We have been hearing for decades from rabbis and cantors and educators and scholars that this needed to be out there. And so we didn't want to wait for the availability of a full Hebrew English edition to have this out there. So we released it in English only edition, like the kind of blue version that some of you may know that I've been showing. And we hope to have a Hebrew English one available over the coming years.
I applaud that decision. And I think you mentioned in a previous conversation that, it also makes it accessible to people who don't know Hebrew. It makes it a great translation for such people who may not need that whole half of a big, heavy book.
I'll say it's a challenge we face. It's a good problem to have at JPS. So I don't mean to complain, but we really experience a tremendous range of individuals using our translations, from academic Bible scholars and rabbis whose biblical Hebrew is so good they mainly use our translation to criticize it, which is completely fine. I love getting those emails, to prisoners in jails across the United States who want a translation of the Tanakh and are not Jewish, can't read Hebrew, to interfaith groups that are trying to wrestle with it together, to Jewish teenagers who maybe have never seen Hebrew before. We really feel like it's important to offer this in a way that is as accessible as possible to as many readers and communities as possible. One of the ways we do that is by offering an English-only edition. One of the ways we're going to do that is by offering an English-Hebrew edition.
Thank you. I had one or two other things, but do you want to maybe conclude with what you were going to present, and then we'll come back to Q&A?
Absolutely. So the final point that I want to think about first, let's see if I can again successfully share the right screen. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing the PowerPoint now.
Yep.
The final point I want to think about has less to do with what we do in our translation and more to do with how we illuminate what we do, how we've approached the task of making our choices and approaches visible and legible to readers and communities. As we've seen, translation is not a simple task, right? From the meta level where we ask what the goal of a translation is to the micro level where we ask how specific words or phrases should be rendered. Very little about the work of translation is obvious or self-executing. All translations involve choosing to pursue some options rather than others. We think that empowering readers and communities involves being clear and open about those choices. And so we've tried to create a number of resources that can enable this process of empowerment, focusing on two ways in which readers and communities might encounter and explore our translation. So first of all, recognizing that the Tanakh is a text that many of us encounter in print, we've tried to make sure that print editions of our new translation include a number of tools designed to make its overarching goals and many of its specific choices visible to readers. So for example, we've included a detailed yet accessible and brief preface that outlines many of the overarching principles I've just discussed, right? That explains what we mean when this translation is described as gender sensitive, and that goes through how we think about God and human beings. We've also, in the print edition, reproduced the preface to NJPS, to our 1985 translation, so that readers can situate our new edition both in the history of JPS translations and in the history of Jewish Bible translations more broadly. Moreover, we have many explanatory notes at the bottom of our pages in the translation, some of which were there in 1985, but many of which are new. They don't all address questions relating to gender. Sometimes there's wordplay at work in the Bible's Hebrew that might not be immediately visible to English readers. We have notes that highlight and explain that wordplay. Sometimes there are alternate translations that we considered but rejected. We have notes that identify some of those cases. Sometimes there are ambiguities in the Hebrew text of the Bible, say about whether it's God or an angel who's speaking to a given person or group, or about whether it's the entire Israelite community or just a small subset of that group being addressed by God. And we have notes that identify some of those ambiguities and possibilities and interpretations as well. But some of our notes do address issues relating to gender and try to clarify some of the choices that we've outlined. So for example, if you were to open up our JPS to the page that you see in front of you, to Psalm 24, which we looked at earlier, the psalm where we translate the word melech as king, you would find a note that highlights the first appearance of that word melech and a detailed explanation at the bottom of the page accounting for why we render it as king, because of the military context in which the image appears. So that's one way in which we've tried to make our choices and methods and principles clear, by articulating some of them in the book itself. That's only part of it. We recognize that many readers will encounter text today, not only in print, but also online. Moreover, we also recognize that an online environment offers unique opportunities that a print text might not. And so we've also spent some time thinking about how that online environment might be part of the process of empowering readers and introducing and illuminating our choices, methods, and goals. So first, as I just mentioned, we released our JPS in partnership with Sefaria, the world's largest free digital library of Jewish texts and translations. And you can access it in that library. Just open Sefaria, select Tanakh, select the book and passage you're interested in, go to that passage, go to that top where you can choose translations and select this one. And it will come up as the revised JPS 2023 edition. When it comes to illuminating our choices, one of the most powerful things you can do with Sefaria is to compare this translation to others in real time. If you click on that other translations bit highlighted there, you can explore how a given passage appears across a variety of editions. Really see those choices and methodologies in real time. Moreover, beyond simply making the translation available online, we've also built out a number of resources that are available exclusively online that extend and go beyond our print discussion of the goals and choices animating our translation. So if you go to our website, jps.org, click on books and click on JPS Tanakh Gender Sensitive Edition, you'll find these resources. You'll find, to be sure, a digital copy of that same preface that's there in the print edition. But you'll also find a more extensive essay available exclusively online on gender and translation that goes into much more depth than the preference. For instance, it goes into many technical details about specific words, choices, and grammatical issues. Similarly, you also find sample passages, including some of the ones that I've just discussed, but also others to kind of get at the sense of the different ways in which the Hebrew can be handled. Moreover, if you look not only at our website, but also at Sefaria, you'll find a commentary written by our lead revising translator, Rabbi Dr. David Stein, that tracks every use of a key gender-related term in the Bible. The Hebrew term ish, which is often translated as man, but can have a much broader range of meanings as well. And this commentary from Dr. Stein goes through each appearance of that word, and in each case explains how we've translated, when we use man and when we use person and when we use some other term, and more importantly, why. So you can find that on Sefaria. If you click on the revised JPS edition, click on About This Text, you'll see the translation there. And then finally, to make sure that you watching this are not the only ones who have the experience of seeing me gesticulating wildly while talking about this translation, we have on the JPS YouTube page 3 brief videos about this translation: a 15-minute tour, an overview, a discussion of those changes we've introduced beyond gender, and a discussion of how to use this translation. And so this then is a third key element of our approach to handling issues relating to gender. For us, translation isn't just about what we do, it's also about how we present and illuminate and open up what we do. Precisely because translation matters, because issues relating to gender and the Bible touch on our lives in so many ways, we feel that it's crucial to invite readers and communities into the process of wrestling with the biblical text and making it accessible today. Okay, so if we had more time, there's more we could discuss. And I've also included on your source sheet a guide to additional resources. For the sake of time, though, beyond before we open things up to one final round of questions, maybe Rabbi Andelman, I can just conclude very briefly by thinking about the future, about kind of questions that emerge from the conversation that we've been having. And in particular, I'd love to conclude by highlighting 3 sorts of questions or ongoing conversations that we might carry forward. The first concerns the translation of the Tanakh itself. So I've outlined one approach to addressing issues relating to gender when it comes to the Bible, and it's an approach that I, as JPS director, wholeheartedly endorse. But it's not the only possible approach. Moreover, it's an approach that reflects ongoing work and conversations and research and scholarship. So one question that I think we need to wrestle with then is the following: how might we continue the work of Bible translation? Just as NJPS benefited from review and renewal and revision, are there specific translation choices we've made in our JPS that would benefit from further refinement? As English language usage continues to shift, as biblical scholarship continues to develop, are there further revisions that will be needed for the sake of fidelity to the Bible's Hebrew in ancient contexts? As more and more communities incorporate our JPS into their lives, as conversations about gender and Judaism continue around the globe, will we learn more about ways in which different translation choices resonate? And will that open up new possibilities for conveying the Tanakh's timeless lessons? So this then is one question: how might we carry forth the sacred work of Bible translation into the future? A second question concerns not just the ways in which we might develop our translations, but also ways in which we might extend and expand the resources we use to illuminate those translations. Not too long ago, the sorts of online resources I've described would have been technologically impossible. And not too long in the future, I imagine, some of them may start to feel clunky and out of date. So another question then is the following: what new resources can we develop? What additional steps can we take to make the work of translation visible and intelligible? Are there other sorts of materials that can be digitized? And can those be linked or connected to our translations in ways that illuminate questions relating to gender? Are there ways in which emerging VR and augmented reality technologies might be harnessed to create opportunities to wrestle with these questions? Does AI have anything to offer us here? I don't know, but on some level, that's the point. Technology is changing, and that can pose perils it also holds out potential promise, right? The promise of new ways to invite readers into the work of translation. And finally, if one question has to do with translation itself, and another has to do with the resources around our translations, I think a third and final question has to do with the lives of the communities in which those translations and resources are used and reused, learned and relearned, studies and explored over and over. And here the question is as follows. What might it look like to bring the type of conversation we've just had into the lives of communities and institutions, Jewish and non-Jewish? What might happen if B'nai Mitzvah students or day school and Hebrew school students have the opportunity to think about the sorts of questions that animate our JPS in particular and conversations about Bible translation and gender more broadly? What opportunities might be opened up if the next generation of Jews were to see Judaism and Jewish learning and Bible translation and text study as spaces to think about the questions of gender with which they and so many of their peers are wrestling? Similarly, what might it mean for adult education classes and learning programs at synagogues to dive into texts such as RJPS and associated resources? How might that illuminate the dynamic, ever-changing nature of Torah study? How might that invite readers into parts of the Bible that are too often neglected, such as Nach, like the prophets and writings? And to offer one final example, what might it look like to create spaces at colleges and universities, inside the classroom and beyond, to wrestle with these questions? For Jewish college students who are facing all sorts of challenges today, for non-Jewish college students who might be unfamiliar with the history of Judaism or the Jewish people, what might happen if Judaism were to be experienced as a space of dynamic creativity, as a space where each generation has the opportunity and responsibility to make texts their own, as a space where fidelity to the past and fidelity to the present can go hand in hand? I don't pretend to know the answers to these questions, but I think that they're worth asking. As I shared with Rabbi Andelman, I'm actually going to be stepping down from JPS at the end of June to return to the faculty at the University of Colorado Boulder, but I'm certainly here as a resource through the end of June to think with you about how this might be a part of your communities. And I know that my predecessor at JPS, Rabbi Barry Schwartz, was really responsible for bringing this translation into existence in many ways, will also be available beyond then. So again, I just want to express my gratitude to Rabbi Andelman, to Tani, and to Ellie for the invitation to be here, and to all of you for learning and thinking together.
Thank you so much for such a nuanced and wonderful presentation. I am personally just so grateful that this translation has come out, and I want to make sure people know that again, in the link that was in your email earlier today, to the non-PowerPoint version of the sources, Dr. Sacks has included at the end links to all of these kind of hands-on resources that he was just sharing.
And I'm so sorry, Rabbi Andelman, for interrupting you, but I want to just flag, I believe attending today, we have one of the translators of this text, Rabbi Beth Lieberman, present. And so I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge her and express my gratitude to her for the work she has done and continues to do to make this translation accessible and available. On those lists of future resources, you'll see 2 pieces co-authored by Rabbi Lieberman. So I just wanted to take that time to make sure to acknowledge her as well. I apologize, Rabbi Andelman, for interrupting you.
No, I'm glad you did. She and I were, I thanked her as well. I'm glad that you thanked her publicly, as she deserves. So just on the note of accessibility, there were a couple of questions, meaning, this kind of last chapter of your presentation, kind of how we get this out to the people, and we can acknowledge that a new publication in October 2023, largely for the Jewish community, is not, was tricky timing. So there was a question about audio versions, either for visually impaired or for those of us who, now consume podcasts and audiobooks all the time, and also a question about one rabbinic colleague who's on the Zoom wrote that they struggle to find Torah translations that are at the appropriate reading level for fifth to 7th grade students. How would you assess the new translation in this respect?
Yeah, so I'll take the 2 questions in turn. In terms of an audio version for individuals who would like a version that's accessible to those who may be visually impaired. At the moment, we do not have an audio version of this, although that is certainly on the table as well. But the place to go to, if you're not already familiar with it, is JBI Library. They are a wonderful not-for-profit specifically focused on making texts available in large print version and audio version. We have an audio version of our 1985 TANAKH translation. We do not yet have one of the new translation, but if you already want a audio copy, JBI can provide you with this free of charge. They do truly sacred and holy work, and I'm happy to send to Rabbi Endelman afterwards the contact information for them. And I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to that. They actually have a mandate from the government and the authority from the government to make all of these texts accessible, so it will come at no charge to you. In terms of being appropriate for a 5th and 6th grade reading level, I'll say why I'm smiling in a moment. I think the English is absolutely accessible to a 5th and a 6th grader. My own 6th grader really likes sitting there and comparing it to other translations, so that probably says something about my house. The reason you see me smiling is I'm reminded of the moment when my grandmother turned 80 and decided she was going to celebrate her 80th birthday by reading the entire Tanakh. She'd never read the Bible before, and she called me furious, saying, "This is not a book appropriate for synagogue." So, I can't vouch for all the particular conversations about some of the topics in the Tanakh that you might have to discuss with a 5th or a 6th grader, but absolutely, I think the reading level here is appropriate, and I am happy to be a resource for thinking about particular ways to incorporate this into curricula from 5th and 6th grade through adult education.
Thank you. I have a 6th grader and are about to finish 6th grade. And I think I really appreciated what you said earlier about using this as a B'nai Mitzvah resource, or this could kind of replace the Tanakh or whatever the shul gift for our Bat Mitzvah child is, because because kids are so comfortable thinking in very open ways about gender now. They're growing up in a different just a different context than we were in terms of not being hung up on gender categories, not being sort of wedded to specific conventions. And I wanted to just, in closing, just share 2 comments with you and with the group, not questions, but comments that came in. So one person wrote, "Thank you, Dr. Sacks. You've convinced me to change my mind. I started by thinking that people shouldn't be so sensitive regarding references to gender. The convention of accepting he, him as referring to women as well has been used for years. Why is it no longer enough? Listening to today's learning has convinced me that looking at new ideas is necessary." So what more could you want? And I wanted to share also a comment from a colleague who wrote about studying when she was studying to become a rabbi at HUC in the 1970s. She was learning with Dr. Harry Orlinsky, who was the editor of the 1962 the Torah translation, which is what my dad read the weekly parsha to me out of. He taught a course on Bible translations, and she wrote, "He took pains to talk about the Bible as a living document that had to be rendered in a language as it was used in the time of the translation." This person commenting wrote, "I did a paper on sexism in translations of the 12 minor prophets. I think he would see this as the next step since English usage has changed since the time of the 1962 Torah translation."
I just, if I can very quickly thank both of those participants for those comments. For the first one, these issues are difficult to discuss, and I'm so grateful for you modeling the kind of intellectual vulnerability and engagement that I think so many of us from so many different perspectives could do a better job of bringing to these conversations. And as for the second comment, we talk actually quite a bit in our preface about Professor Orlinsky and NJPS, and how even though this introduces significant changes into NJPS, we see it as very much the natural continuation. So I am honored and humbled to think that the work we're doing can be part of a tradition that he was so deeply and profoundly responsible for shaping.
We want to thank you so much again for a really wonderful presentation, and we're so glad that we got you before you moved on to your next chapter. So really, thank you so much for being part of the part of the series today. Thank you everyone for coming. And if this didn't kind of prime you for another great Bible session, I don't know what would, but we hope that everyone will come back on June 3rd. Professor Ben Summer will be teaching a pre-Shavuot session on kind of what is the genre of the Torah. It's not exactly history, it's not law book, it's not novel, it's not exactly a national saga, kind of what's going on here, what's this distinctive genre about, where did it come from, how has it been received over time. So you have laid a wonderful foundation for that June 3rd session, and we're so grateful to you again for your teaching today.
Well, thank you again to all of you for learning and thinking and inviting me to be part of your intellectual community.
Take care, everyone. We will see you in a couple of weeks after Memorial Day.